Ok. Buenas tardes a las personas que siguen esta transmisión de nuestro Congreso Internacional sobre el maoísmo en América Latina desde una perspectiva global. Vamos a continuar en la tarde de hoy, hora 5 de la tarde, hora de Colombia, 7 de la noche, hora de Argentina. Vamos a continuar con la presentación de nuestra ponencia central. Tenemos el gusto, el honor de presentarles a Matthew Galway. Good morning, Matt. Thank you very much for your participation in our Congress. For us, it's an honor. And I want to introduce to you to the Congress participants, and then I will give you the turn of the for the Conferencia, and at the end, it's possible to answer some questions from the public. Okay. I like to introduce to you. Voy a presentarles a Matt Galway. Él es historiador y máster en historia de la Universidad de Ottawa. Es doctor de la British Columbia. Tiene una amplia experiencia en el estudio del maoísmo en diferentes lugares del mundo. Ha escrito sobre Tanzania, en África, ha escrito sobre Camboya o Kampuchea en el sudoeste asiático, ha escrito recientemente o en los últimos años sobre el Perú, sobre el Partido Comunista del Perú, Sendero Luminoso, y por esa razón hemos querido que Matt sea el ponente central de nuestro Congreso, por esa visión digamos, compleja, abierta. Sus áreas de interés en la Australian National University o son la historia intelectual, la historia del Partido Comunista de China, la historia del Partido Comunista de Kampuchea, Khmer Rouge, y la historia del Partido Comunista del Perú, Sendero Luminoso. Esas son sus áreas de interés. Su libro más reciente es el que aparece en la pantalla de la conferencia. Es un libro que recién aparece este año y como ustedes lo ven, tiene que ver con la historia del maoísmo en Kampuchea. Además de eso, tiene una larga lista de publicaciones. Voy a resumir apenas o a mencionar algunos de sus trabajos, algunos de sus preocupaciones académicas, intelectuales. Ha publicado, por ejemplo, digamos, textos sobre el maoísmo global y los movimientos comunistas en Perú y Camboya, 1965-1992. Ha publicado trabajos sobre la nueva democracia y la campechanización del marxismo-leninismo. Ha trabajado, publicado en Italia textos sobre el maoísmo global. Ha trabajado también, tiene publicaciones sobre el Partido Comunista de Nepal y su crisis de legitimidad. Y también tiene reflexiones sobre el comunismo chino y los conceptos políticos de Mao a Xi. Además ha trabajado con diferentes académicos de China y de otros lugares del mundo para elaborar artículos que reflejan o que analizan el fenómeno del maoísmo en diferentes lugares del mundo. Por esta razón, repito, para nosotros es un gusto, es un placer tener a Matt en el día de hoy, por esta visión compleja, esta visión comparativa, esta reflexión permanente que lo lleva a polemizar sobre un tema bastante complejo como es la noción de maoísmo global. En ese sentido, no sé si aquí o más adelante en la sección de preguntas él pueda reflexionar en torno a esta noción de maoísmo global y sus diferencias, por ejemplo, con la interpretación de Julia Lowell. Ahí hay una polémica. Matt escribió una reseña muy interesante que recomiendo a quienes siguen esta transmisión sobre el libro de Julia Lowell, una reseña bastante polémica, extensa, muy compleja. Entonces, sin más, quiero dejarlos con Matt Galway, reiterando nuestro agradecimiento por su participación. Please, Matt, it's your turn now. You can start your conference.
Miguel.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Muchas gracias, Miguel, y muchas gracias a todos y todas por la oportunidad to share about this book that I've put so much of energy and love into in the last few years, and to finally see come to fruition this March 15th pass. So thank you, everyone, for the conference organizers and all who are here. I know it's later in the evening, but I truly appreciate everyone's making this happen to realize this opportunity to share this work. So today I will be going through my book, rather than just kind of discussing all of the various issues that are at work in the book and spoiling the plot, so to speak. I will be breaking down a key theme of global Maoism through the life of one particular figure who was important in the forming of the Communist Party of Cambodia, specifically the Minister of Information, Hu Nim. So we'll be looking very much at him. So today's talk will begin with just an introduction to the traveling theory that is so central to my book's overarching format. Then I'll break it down into the form of a triptych. It'll consist of 3 parts. First part will provide the background, the political history of the China-Cambodia friendship that coalesces around the time that the Chinese Communist Party is engaging in diplomacy in that first crucial 17-year period of the CCP's power in China from 49 to 65. We'll then move specifically to an intellectual biography of Brother Boas, or Hu Nim. This is someone who is at the center of many radical circles in both Cambodia and then before that in Paris. And then I will look at one fascinating organization, a network in which Hu Nim participated actively, and that is the Association d'Amitié Khmer-Chinois, or the Sino-Khmer Friendship Association, or the China-Khmer-Chinese Friendship Association is also the more common name for it. So this one here, the Gaomian Zhongguo Youhao Xiehui, a major cultural diplomatic organization that formed in the early 1960s, but was closed in 1967. And then I'll take us up to his exclusion from the party center and eventual death in Tuolsleng prison S21 in 1977. So as I often begin with all of my talks about global Maoism, it's important to situate why Maoism becomes this very important wellspring for intellectuals, radicals, labor unionists, etc., why they're drawn to it. And I think that one thing that captures the zeitgeist of this period is very much this massive wave of decolonization, whether it's against the encroachment of American imperialism, whether it's the encroachment of the Soviet Union, and in the case of Southeast Asia and parts of most of Africa for that matter, there's this sense of kind of this malaise about what does one do to fight back against the harsh oppression of colonialism. And for this, I always turn to Albert Camus. And I think 3 resonant quotes that will help us guide through or proceed through understanding the mindset that these intellectuals who became Maoists were in are all from his 1951 book, L'Homme Révolté, or Man in Revolt, The spirit of rebellion can only exist in groups where a theoretical equality conceals great factual inequalities. We'll see this in Hunyam's dissertation, how he tries to wrestle with that. In every rebellion, one finds the metaphysical demand for unity, the impossibility of capturing it, and the construction of a substitute universe. Rebellion, from this point of view, is a fabricator of universes. And indeed, in the rebellion of the Khmer Rouge, the Communist Party of Kampuchea, or CPK, you see an attempt to envision and then establish this new universe in brutal fashion, as we see between 1975 and 1979. And then the final quote, rebellion cannot exist without a strange form of love. And I think that ultimately we have to understand that the people who flock towards Maoism, and even those who became Maoists and became especially brutal figures in the Communist Party of Kampuchea, did so initially because they saw something wrong in society, and because they loved their country and their people, they wanted to try and correct it using a radical solution. Now, it is harder to find that kind of greater sense of care and attachment in the work, say, of Pol Pot, but certainly in among the more moderate figures in the party, like a Hunim or a Huyun, both of whom are dead by 1977, you get a sense that they were motivated towards alleviating poverty and helping improve the living standards of peasants. So we'll begin with the working theory in the book, which is drawing heavily from Said's triad from A Traveling Theory, which you'll find is a chapter in The World, the Text, and the Critic. And he proposes three very novel processes that explain how ideas travel across cultures. There's the production of an idea, the transmission of that idea, and then its reception by a new host. So I've tried to expand upon this by adding these subset problems and phases. So the final set of reception, I find, is not a single step. You have the impact or relational stage of this, where someone who is receiving this idea is immediately struck by how it might fit. It fills a void in society, or it fills a void in the intellectual culture of the day, and this is a corrective to something that they see as needing a correction. There's also the conditions or the historical conditions and factors into which those ideas emerge. So in China in the 1910s, Marxism emerges as an important ideological discourse precisely because they're confronting with various issues, not the least of which is the failure or the waning successes of the Chinese Republic, the nascent Republic of China. And then there's the practical part of reception. How do I use these ideas in the now? How do I practice them? I've added two new stages to this overarching theoretical framework, one including adaptation, ever so central to understanding Maoismo, and how this engages or takes shape in two forms: an intellectual/practical stage, where the idea is wrestled with and adapted on the page, and then in initial practice, and then there is the normative production. As Mao Zedong said, one must always have a framework of theory, practice, and theory. It is because you take the theory, you apply it in practice, and then you learn from your mistakes and revise the theory. And adaptation in the Maoist style takes that shape. And then the final stage is implementation. And you see that in the first 26 or 27 years of the People's Republic of China. You see Mao try to apply, with the help of course, his lieutenants in the CCP, try to apply his ideas that he had framed during the Yan'an period in the 1930s and 40s to the entire country of the People's Republic of China. And this takes the shape of consolidation. So consolidating who's in the party and eliminating enemies or potential hurdles. Economic reconfiguration. So overhauling society, in this case, establishing a socialist mode of production. And then the final one, the social transformation / revolutionary perpetuation stage. The social transformation is making sure that your changes affect all aspects of society so that everybody is on board with it. It's not just in the economic realms. And then the fact that all Maoist movements must confront is that you must have a Buduan Geming, or at least a Jishu Geming, permanent revolution, or at least a continuous revolution, to justify and safeguard the revolutionary successes. So I draw heavily from Philip Kuhn's article, The Origins of the Typing Vision, in breaking down the socio-contextual factors and phases underlining one's reception. Looking at the language of the materials. So what language are they reading these materials in, and why is that important? And looking at, most importantly, I think when we're looking at Maoism, the process whereby an idea resonates with others. So where the key factor for Philip Kuhn was that he was trying to understand how Hellfire Protestantism in China in the 1860s had found its way to the far reaches of the Guangxi Hills. And he was trying to say, like, how do ideas that were only accessible to, say, a small group of people reach and resonate with people who would otherwise never know these ideas and never, ever encounter them? And how do they resonate with them? Why do these ideas matter to them? And that's another important part of the adaptation phase. So the goal, of course, in this book and in using this theoretical framework is to track how these encounters with radical materials, namely Maoism, how these ideas take shape. How do they find currency? How do they manifest in actual practice? And how do the person who is interacting with these ideas change those ideas or adapt them to fit the historical situation in which they find themselves? The goal, of course, is to take seriously the engagements with these radical ideological discourses, including Maoism, in social experiences and political writings, and in the case here today, to identify how Hunim spoke back once he became an intellectual activist and politician in Cambodia's global 60s. But naturally, there's not a lot of information out there on Hunim. He's written about fairly frequently in quick, brief compass in the works by Ben Kiernan, David Chandler, all big names who work on Cambodia. However, there's no extant English language intellectual history on members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea that goes strictly all the way back to their early life experiences. And there's no extant English language intellectual history of the China-Cambodia relationship. None of this exists as of yet. Sacha Scher, and as I've got here, the writings of Sung Sekun, an ex-Khmer Rouge himself, you have a lot of these really, really useful inquests into trying to understand how one's individual experiences and encounters with these ideas manifest in their life. But you still don't really get a sense of the big picture of the China-Cambodia relationship and how Maoism figures prominently both in the party's practice and in the main intellectual thrust who formed the party and devised this ideology, how Maoism figured into their various stages of their life and careers. So you have plenty, like I said, you have plenty of stuff in French. You've got Sung Sekun, you've got Henri Locard, you've Sacha Scher. They've all written extensively on some of these initial links, but they're mostly in the realm of either diplomatic history or, in this case, biography for Sung Sekun. So as a result, the origins of the CPK's worldview tends to fall into largely artificial or convenient explanations without an analysis of social experiences, topographies, intellectual exchanges, languages of the materials that they're interacting and why that matters, how they got them, who translated them, and then these cross-national links. So I just got the book covers here for anyone who wants to check them out. I highly recommend Le Kampuchea des Khmer Rouges. This one here is a very important work for my own study. So to understand how Maoism really finds its way outside of China, one look no further than the CCP's efforts at outreach to the third world. And by third world, I don't use it in the contemporary sense or meaning of it, but in the original sense that Mao used it and the CCP used it, which is any non-aligned country that is neither aligned, that is neither in the orbit or sphere of influence of the United States or the Soviet Union. China would identify itself, the CCP would, as a third world country, and virtually the entire continents of Africa, Latin America, and South America would all be included, and then Southeast Asia, of course, would be included in the this various area, this various third world, right? So you get Central America in there, South America, continental Africa, Southeast Asia. Japan wouldn't be in there because they're allied with the US. So little things like that. And there are three major efforts of this third world outreach. The spirit of Bandung, which emerges at and then after the Bandung Conference, the non-aligned movement, kind of seminal movement in the Afro-Asian solidarity movement. This is the whole idea of non-interference and respecting everybody's autonomy and allowing countries to develop socialism the way that they wanted to, rather than what Moscow or Washington, D.C. declared. There's the revolutionary approach, which the CCP took by supporting revolutionary movements abroad, both rhetorically and materially. And then there's the radical ideological approach, where this occurs specifically during the Cultural Revolution, where the CCP is actively seeking to export the Chinese revolutionary experience and Maoism globally through the mass translation and dissemination of Mao texts. Now, for the first part, the spirit of Bandung, you have the emergence of the five people's principles, which Sophie Richardson details extensively in her brilliant book with Columbia University Press. And this is all again about respecting a mutual respect for autonomy, mutual respect for each other's, and keep maintaining their non-alignment, maintaining their own system of government. And China, through Zhou Enlai's personal diplomacy at Bandung, is able to secure new relationships with countries like Cambodia, with Prince Sihanouk, who is the head of state. And it is through these promises of non-intervention, non-interference, and support to allow him to do what he wants for his country, rather than saying, oh, China's going to dictate how you proceed. It's through that personal respect and friendship that emerges between them and mutual trust that the Sino-Cambodian relations really take off for the first time in a very long time. And here I just have some images of Prince Sihanouk and his many visits to China. There are numerous newspapers, including state media, Renmin Ribao, People's Daily, that wrote extensively of Sihanouk's visits. He was very beloved, and the whole point again was to sell to the public and internationally that China was a supporter of non-aligned countries' right to self-determination and non-intervention. And in the case of Sihanouk, he wanted to maintain neutrality, as in he wanted absolutely nothing to do with either the Soviets or the United States, if it meant he had to give up that neutrality. Another aspect of this outreach by the CCP was to have leaders from various countries come to visit China and see what on the ground in real life, what is going on in China, and hopefully to take back a good impression of that experience. So the hosting of foreign representatives and revolutionaries, as I mentioned, it has domestic and international purposes. It is to sell to the people back home, excuse me, sell to people at home that the revolution, the Chinese revolution, is one for world peace and is not aggressive like the one in, say, the Soviet Union or the aggressive capitalist imperialism of the United States. It also fosters Mao's ideas of greater unity through global realignment that he presents during visits of heads of states and leaders of parties that oppose them. Now, Sihanouk himself is not a communist. In fact, by the 1960s, he's an actively anti-communist leader. But he is beloved just the same. And he's important in China to show that China doesn't care if you're communist or as long as you're non-aligned and you're not going to side with the DC or Moscow, that you are welcome and China wants to protect world peace. Now, how much of that we actually believe? We obviously know in history that no, the CCP was actively involved in supporting revolutions and toppling regimes overseas. However, this is an important media boon for the CCP to establish itself as a country that is welcoming to foreign leaders, even if they are not communist. And this is also part of China's own path, the CCP's path to break with the Soviet model of bureaucratic centralism and to find its own way to establish its own Chinese road to socialism. Nick Knight has discussed this extensively in his book, Rethinking Mao. So the People's Republic of China's commitment to non-interference in Cambodia manifests itself also amongst overseas Chinese, importantly, Huaqiao. And you see here in copies of the overseas Chinese language newspaper, this one based in Phnom Penh, the capital, Jinbian, Mianhua Ribao, or Sino-Khmer Daily. This was the official propaganda outlet of the People's Republic of China Embassy in Cambodia. And it was an extremely popular Chinese language newspaper among the overseas Chinese communities that lived in Cambodia, a not insignificant part of their population. And some of the titles of some articles include "The Sino-Khmer Friendship is Magnificent," "The Chinese and Cambodian People's Lasting Affection and Deep Friendship," "The Hearts of the Peoples of China and Cambodia Beat Together," "Let the Flower of the China-Cambodia Friendship Be Forever in Bloom." You get the idea. It's very supportive of those ongoing fraternal friendships, and that they have an unwavering support of Prince Sihanouk, even though he is himself both a monarch, though he will abdicate his throne in 55 and then run as a public citizen. He is still nevertheless beloved and amongst his people, and then in China, he of course will be liked as well. China wants to communicate through this propaganda outlet coming from the PRC embassy that China is in his corner, that the CCP supports Sihanouk, even though he's not communist, and that the CCP wants Cambodia to develop itself autonomously. Now, naturally, it has strategic reasons for doing so. It does not want the United States to step in and take over the, direct the politics there. And then what do you have? You have a country, a US sphere of influence right on China's doorstep. So it is motivated by realpolitik as well. But the amount of effort that the CCP put into both cultural diplomacy and in the press and in terms of propaganda, it's actually quite a fascinating phenomenon. So I just have some articles here, and of course the French reaction to these newspapers and to Sihanouk's friendship with Chairman Mao. You see in this issue here, this cartoon of Chairman Mao leering over Sihanouk, as if to say that Mao is the master of Cambodia and it's only a matter of time that it becomes communist. And here I just have an issue of Bito Jianbao showing that, by the 60s, China's taking an active interest in what's going on in Southeast Asia, specifically the war in Vietnam, of which Cambodia is an unwitting participant. And then I just want to skip ahead to this image here, which I really like. Chairman Mao is hosting Sihanouk and presenting him with a medal for his anti-imperialism, for standing up to the United States and the Soviet Union. And these types of public ops are really important, again, for selling the CCP for the Chinese. They say, oh, wow, the CCP is truly committed to world peace. Look at what they're doing. They're even meeting with Sihanouk, who's not communist. So that is a very important way to sell the revolution to the Chinese people. By the 1960s, though, hosting political leaders, whether left or right or neutral, becomes almost secondary to hosting those leaders of parties that the CCP aligns with ideologically. And one very, very important visit occurred in late 1965, 1966, when Pol Pot visits as a member of the Khmer Workers' Party, which was at the time, the Vietnamese-led, or at least heavily Vietnamese-guided precursor to the Khmer Rouge. And he goes via Hanoi to visit Beijing to meet with the CCP. And he is able to go there because in 1965, he goes to Hanoi to ask for support from Le Duan, then one of the leading figures of the Vietnamese Communist Party, for permission to raise the communist revolution, to initiate a communist revolution against Sihanouk. He wants to get rid of Sihanouk. He wants to establish the Communist Party in Cambodia as the preeminent state power. Le Duan tells him, and I think this is important because it's a very good strategic move on his part, that the victory in South Vietnam must happen first. That if Cambodia is launching a revolution against Sihanouk, Sihanouk will then be unable to guarantee the Ho Chi Minh Trail for North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese communists, to move people and supplies and men down to, like fighting men, to be able to go down into the South and continue the revolution against the Americans. So he says, you can't do it. We do not give you permission to do it. So Pol Pot then goes to China. And when he arrives in China, he's given a warm reception. He meets with, according to several sources, including Vietnamese sources, meets with several CCP officials who give him a warm welcome, as I mentioned. In his capacity as an attaché of the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, he stays in the Yafe Lao Pechun Zhongshin. This is the the Asia, Africa, Latin America Training Center on the outskirts of Beijing. And this is where Abimelech Guzman will stay when he visits China shortly after Pol Pot leaves. It is during this visit that Pol Pot presents his program to CCP figures. And the CCP approves of his program and says, you should definitely start a revolution against Sihanouk. Because Mao was personal friends with Sihanouk and Zhou Enlai was personal friends with Sihanouk, they could not announce their approval. They were still actively and openly politically supporting Sihanouk. So they had to do this sub rosa. They had to do this secretly. There's no mention in any official CCP archives and documents that they even had this visit, but the Vietnamese sources confirmed that Pol Pot returned to Cambodia and that he, within days or even months upon returning to Cambodia, he changes the name of the party to the Communist Party of Kampuchea, as an homage to the Communist Party of China. Another factor that arises aside from these visits is the mass translation and dissemination of Mao works. So even, people, not everybody could go visit China. It's extremely hard to get into even now. And so back then, just how do you even take an interest in Maoism? By 1965, the CCP had decided that they wanted to draw upon extant methods to spread wisdom in the country. And the CCP, its own Zhongshanbu, its own propaganda departments, Bolshevik style agitprop, to try and find a way to harness what they believe to be the genius of Mao Zedong thought, collect his various writings, including some resonant quotes, and translate them into dozens of languages. And this becomes the Little Red Book and the collected works of Chairman Mao. And they're translated via the Foreign Languages Press, or the Waiwen Chubanshu, which is established in 1952. And then these are distributed internationally by the Golgi Tulshu, or the International Bookstore, International Book Depository. And these institutions, under the aegis of the CCP, are able to bring together talented translators who then take Mao's most important essays and speeches, compile them into volumes, translate them into English, French, Spanish, Bahasa Indonesia, Arabic, Russian, and then send them out to all corners of the world for little or no cost at all. They're cheaply made, but they're cheap. They're either, like I said, they're very easy to afford. In some cases, you could get them for free. And although they never made a Khmer language version of this book, they made French language translations. And the reason why this is important for our purposes is that CPK will encounter Maoism not in Cambodia, but in the streets of Paris in the 1950s. So here, just from my book cover, I have from another issue of Ditu Jianbao, or War Dispatches. This is a particularly rich example of the foreign policy of the CCP in 1965-66, where it says, the boundless radiance of Mao Zedong thought shines throughout the world. And you see all the rays going to all corners of the globe. In the top left corner, you see all peoples of the world carrying Mao's translated works, this Little Red Book. So they have a quick reference guide if they need to consult Mao's wisdom. And then in the bottom left to right, you have, of course, the study sessions, foreigners going to China to study Mao Zedong thought. Abimel Guzman will do this himself. And then you have tours of model work sites. And then you have friendship associations, which we'll get into a little bit later. And then the more violent end of this global dissemination of Maoism, the active support of revolutionaries and then Maoist parties in countries like even South Africa. And in the case of UNITA in Angola, another example of a China-aligned Maoist party. And there are several others, but I'll just use those examples here. So there's some images from China Pictorial, which is one of my favorite resources for really vibrant pictures of the CCP era. Here we just have some soldiers, some commanders and fighters of the 10th Company studying Little Red Books, the very iconic Little Red Book that was so pervasive during the 60s. And then here, party branch organized on a company basis to study again these Maoist works. Again, so for their own moral and intellectual edification. This is what the party wanted through that kind of Mao-centric iconoclasm of the 1960s to try and spur people to seeing in Mao this infinite wisdom that had global resonance. But I think at that point that it's a good segue to get into the case of Hu Nim. He's born into a rural village in Korkor in Kompong Siem. He's born to mixed Chinese Khmer lineage. He's raised in a poor peasant family, unlike Pol Pot or Kusampan, both of whom were born in a rural setting, but had been born to wealthy peasant families. Because of his parents' impoverished status, he was only able to attend school through the pagoda, or the Wat, Vat in Khmer. And at Wat Mien, he's able to study the classics and Buddhism, but he's able to also distinguish himself as a keen student. And it is within only a short time that the French notice his talent, and he is able to win admission to the exclusive French Collège Notre Dame Sihanouk, named after then the young prince of Cambodia. And at this junior high school in Kampong Cham, Hu Nim will meet many of his future Khmer Rouge colleagues. Khieu Samphan went there, and Hu Yun went there. The French, it's important to understand why these schools are important sites of nationalism, because the French had, when they essentially established the Protectorate of Cambodge in the 1860s, they had established what John Tully would describe as a colonial police state. Although the country was ruled as a protectorate, it was in fact ruled with an iron hand under the aegis of the region's true authority, the Gouverneur Général, the Governor General, and the Résident Supérieur. These were the high authorities in Cambodia, not the king or the prince. And it is through the French kind of fascination with what they discover in Cambodia. They weren't the first to discover it, but to them it's new. They see in Cambodia the former site of a great empire. French sociologists, French anthropologists, and the like, they tour the country and they visit places like Angkor Wat and Bayon Temple. And they believe over time, and you can capture this in their writings, that the Khmer Empire, the predecessor of Cambodia, was the host of one of the great civilizations in human history. French anthropologists will liken it to ancient Greece and Rome. But in doing this, in building up this, what Penny Edwards calls a temple complex of a once great Khmer civilization, they are also juxtaposing it against the current low point of Cambodia unfairly. You used to be so great. You built Angkor Wat. You had this vast empire. What happened? Why is the country now relying on the French to rescue it from the Vietnamese and the Thai coming nearby? And this establishes a sense of great insecurity and great frustration among Cambodians, especially students who are taught this in schools. So while the French are fetishizing the Cambodian past, right? They're kind of exploring and they're building up Phnom Penh to be this marvelous city that replete with beaux-arts buildings and reflecting French achievement. They're at the same time telling my people in the structures they build and in the history books they write that there used to be this great civilization and that they're not presently great. They're presently weak and need the French to save them, need French civilization to rescue them. And this kind of fetishization of my past with a present state of racist attitudes towards Khmers creates this sense of French status, that one must learn French to succeed, one must be French to succeed. And Hu Nim himself will study in French through going to the collège and then eventually the lycée Sissoua, a high school, a private high school. So what's important is Philip Short says in his book, Pol Pot, that to understand the semiotics of status in French Cambodge. Hu Nim, like his colleagues, would speak French. He would attend French schools. He would grow up in a French colony. French thus became the prism through which he viewed the world. The problem was that the French centralized education system had the entire body master the same knowledge. It was relatively fairly late, mid-20s, early 30s, that the French actually start building contemporary style schools for Khmer students to attend. Before they would just, to fill the civil service, they would bring in Vietnamese and Chinese students from Vietnam to become the civil servants who would handle all of the administrative matters and affairs in Cambodia. By the 20s and 30s, they start to revise this and they're like, we need to train Khmers to do this. But they made no adaptation to local conditions with their curricula. Their goal was ultimately to make them turn into Frenchmen. So they were to identify with French history and French political values. As Khieu Samphan, once the premier of the Communist Party of Kampuchea and the premier of Democratic Kampuchea, once reflected, we were profoundly influenced by the spirit of French thought, by the Age of Enlightenment of Rousseau and Montesquieu. But the irony, the ultimate irony, some would even call the perverse incentive, is that you have this pathway to becoming proper civil servants of a French domain, but the immersion in the French inspired, in the emergence of the French classics actually inspires nationalist imaginings. So the French would emphasize the greatness of the French Revolution, but not expect Khmer students to use the French Revolution as a call for Cambodian independence. It's part of the wonderful parts of the colonial naivete of the French time. So naturally, as was customary in many colonies of the era, the particularly gifted students could win a bursary to go study in the metropole, and in this case, could go study in France. So I've got a list here of many important Communist Party of Kampuchea figures, Huyun, Salazar, Kusampan, Hunim, all of whom went to Paris to study. They would all live at the Pavillon Indochinoise, itself a residence dormitory for the University of Paris students and some nearby colleges. They could all live in there and they could congregate. So once again, this French lack of foresight, they don't realize that putting a bunch of Cambodians in close proximity to a bunch of Vietnamese will not only spur calls for nationalism, national independence, but also put them into contact with communists, which is what happens at the Pavillon d'Indochinoise. So it is now, you've now got the Maison de Cambodge, which you can find near the Jardin Luxembourg in France today in Paris. And it is here in these sites where members like Hunim will come into contact with members of the French Communist Party. And they will join language groups. The Cercle Marxiste is one, the Marxist Circle, where they will read pieces like La Nouvelle Démocratie or On New Democracy by Mao for the very first time. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, the language of the materials is an important piece to understanding the greater puzzle of global Maoism. These intellectuals like Hunim are reading Maoist works in French. How are they getting them? They're getting them from the French Communist Party, which is translating Russian translations of the Chinese originals. So it's a fascinating way to understand how those ideas travel and how those ideas translate relatively closely across the French and Russian versions. So I just have an image here of Kusampan. This is a very rare photo of him in Paris, performing as Sita in the Riem Chaos, also known as the Ramayana, a very famous Hindu epic that is very, very close to Khmer Buddhist practice. It's been adapted to be a Buddhist tale, of course, as you see in Thailand as well. It is also during this time in Paris where Pol Pot writes his first ever political writing. This is entitled Monarchy or Democracy, and it is his first piece. He wrote it by hand. There was no Khmer typewriter during those times. And this piece here is important because he uses Buddhism as a lens through which to interpret how democracy should take shape in Cambodia. You'll see he's got some pieces in there in French, Révolution de 1789, the 1789 French Revolution. He mentions Robespierre. He says Danton instead of Danton, just a typo. Stalin is there too. And if you look, he also mentions, and he doesn't have it in English or French here, but he does discuss the Republican Revolution in China as an example of how people can come together, bring Buddhism back into, make Cambodia great again by bringing Buddhism back into the picture, and that democracy can be achieved that way. So one of the reasons why I use this piece is that at the bottom, he signs it as Khmer Daim. He doesn't sign it as his own name. Khmer Daim means original Khmer. So even by 1952, when he wrote this, he had this idea of Khmer racial or ethnic purity. And he gets this from his mentor, King Bansak. We'll get into him later. But I just want to point this piece out as one piece of the puzzle of engaging with ideas from outside and trying to ground them in the experience of Cambodia, a historical situation. Now, as we know, Pol Pot will eventually found the Communist Party, or he'll take it in a different direction rather. He'll become the leader by the mid-1950s, one of the main leading figures, if not the leading figure. Here I just have a photo from 1971, where he's seated prominently in the front. He's going to return without his degree in 1953 to Cambodia and will join the revolution almost instantly. Like him, Hunim will actually continue his studies. Hunim arrives in Paris shortly after Pol Pot leaves, but he's still there at a time where he gets to meet very important political intellectuals like Huyun and Kusampan, who will influence his work and ideas greatly. Hunim studies in Paris for a bit, but he'll ultimately finish his PhD at the Université Royale de Phnom Penh, which is now the Royal University of Phnom Penh, but it used to be called the Royal Khmer University. He will write an economics doctoral dissertation in 1965, which becomes an important piece of the puzzle of democratic Kampuchea. He argues in his thesis that the Cambodian economy is oriented exploitatively around foreign interests, and that the state ought to seize control of foreign trade and finance. He's drawing heavily from the work of Samir Amin, himself an Egyptian Maoist, a French-Egyptian Maoist. He calls for autonomous development and agricultural sector to replace the private sectors in modernizing and developing Cambodia. His case studies include praise for North Korea, specifically praise for Mao in the first four-year plan, also known as the Little Leap, which ran until 1954. He also provides an extensive Maoist-influenced peasant analysis, where he breaks down the various socioeconomic classes in the rural sector. So poor peasants, middle peasants, rich peasants, the same way that Mao did in his investigations in the 1930s. Ben Kiernan has called this the most detailed and penetrating analysis of the Cambodian rural socioeconomic structure. And although it's not a manual for revolution, it uses Maoism to interpret Cambodian crises and shape solutions for them. If anyone's ever interested in reading Hunim's dissertation, I currently have a hard copy of it, and I would love to digitize it and share it. So just remind me after the talk. So how does Hunim turn from very kind of left-leaning Communist Party member in France to important political figure, and then eventually a Maoist guerrilla fighting with the Communist Party of Kampuchea in the countryside? Well, upon his return to Cambodia, Hunim will work for two leftist newspapers. He'll work for Réalité Cambodienne, and then he'll work for Free People, this is a Khmer language newspaper. He'll also work for The Nationalist, which was Sihanouk's private newspaper, or the newspaper that was effectively his mouthpiece. It is also during this time that he joins Parliament. He becomes a member, he runs as a politician in Cambodia, and he's extremely popular because of his peasant-centric ideas and policies. He joins oppressed members of southern Cambodia, many of whom with ties to Pol Pot's Khmer Worker Party, which will be renamed the Communist Party of Kampuchea in 1965, on a complaint commission that handled land disputes over claims and confiscations. He will press assembly members to sever ties with the United States so that they were no longer relying on the United States for aid at all, saying let's not have any aid whatsoever. His progressive activities will eventually bring him into the orbit of the PRC, the North Korean and the North Vietnamese, who are based in Phnom Penh. And it is through this close contact that Hunim recalls in his first confession that the Chinese became an important figure, an important presence in his life. So I just have two images here from 1973 of Hunim welcoming Sihanouk into the liberated zones. I'll more into that in a bit. So Hunim is brought into the orbit of the Chinese, who are interested, the embassy's interested in him, politicians are interested in him, figures, representatives are interested in him. They want to know what he's up to. And it is through that close connection with the Chinese that he becomes very interested in not only what's going on in China, but witnessing it for himself. So in the early 1960s, he's encouraged by the embassy to go to China. And he does. He visits as a member of the Association d'Amitié Khmer-Chinoise, or the Khmer Chinese Friendship Association, which forms informally in 1961 and officially in 1964. Hunim is one of the founders. And this association promotes China-Cambodia exchanges, in which they discuss the value of Mao thought as a global ideology. Of course, it's again part of the Cultural Revolution export idea, right? That whole wave of trying to export Maoism abroad that really emerges in the Cultural Revolution. As Hunim recalled in his confession, the Chinese liked me even more wholeheartedly because on the one hand, I respected and studied Mao Zedong thought, and on the other, I took a stand against the revisionists, the Soviet Union. So you get a sense of the Sino-Soviet split going on here. Although he's the official president of this Khmer Chinese Friendship Association, Sihanouk eventually grows wary of their activities. He believes that it is transforming into a Maoist anti-government organization. It's certainly forming into a Maoist organization, but not one that necessarily had a government at this stage. In either case, he outlaws them in 1967. He also bans Chinese language newspapers, including Mianhua Ribao or Sino-Khmer Daily. And he threatens people like Hunim, leftist ministers who were very popular in the National Assembly. He threatens them to the point of even saying he'll court-martial them or even have them killed. And this pushes Hunim to flee to the countryside, to join with Pol Pot and join the communist movement to take state power, which they do in 1975. Here, I just want to show, I apologize for the quality of the images. They are photocopies of photocopies. Getting the original version of this quarterly of the Sino-Khmer Friendship Association is quite difficult. So I just have here a performance of the Red Detachment of Women, a very famous Cultural Revolution model opera that emerged in great popularity during the Cultural Revolution. And then there would be a Cambodian dance troupe that would follow afterwards to promote, again, these cultural diplomatic exchanges. You had the meeting of leaders. So again, Sihanouk meeting with Zhou Enlai. Sihanouk's on the far right, Zhou Enlai's just to his left on the couch. These types of exchanges, again, are the whole point of having this association. So Hunim himself is, again, he's drawn to China because he wants to, he wants to see what great achievements the Cultural Revolution has done and what Mao has done in China. He looks to model revolutionaries like Hu Samfan, Hu Yun, and Fu Che, who have written about in another piece, who are all themselves leftist politicians and or activists. Hunim returns from his China trip in 65, 66 with an enthusiastic and positive view of what he witnessed in Mao's China. And they even hold, of course, these exhibits of Chinese antiquities that go on in Cambodia, despite Sihanouk's outlawing of the AAKC, outlawing of Chinese newspapers. These are acts of defiance that he tries to make to establish himself as, again, someone who's clearly in support of China. And he actually wrote about it here. I just have an English language copy of Peking Review, which details his trip. And they note that, this is when he arrived. And I have the Chinese language version of this as well, but it is very hard to read on PowerPoint. So I went with the English one. So if anybody would like to look at this, I can share that copy after the talk. So as I mentioned, as time is running out, I'll just kind of breeze through this. Sihanouk shutters the AAKC, threatens leftist ministers and political figures with their life. And this becomes the big test to the China-Cambodia relationship. Sihanouk even blames his friend Zhou Enlai for ginning up Maoist fervor in his country and violating the autonomy of Cambodian political affairs. The first attack by China, he would declare in Cambodia's private newspapers. 1967, though, of course, the very year that he's shuttering these newspapers and shutting down the association, you have the uprising in Samlaut in Battambang in northwestern Cambodia. And this initiates the Cambodian Civil War. Now, with all of these ministers like Hunim who have fled to join Pol Pot in the countryside, they are now part of fighting this war against Sihanouk, and then in 1975 against the CIA and US-backed Lon Nol regime, the Khmer Republic of 1970 to 1975. And it is through this fight the Khmer Rouge start building their base of support against both Sihanouk and then, most crucially, against Lon Nol. So just some images that are associated with that period. By 1973, by 1970, as I mentioned, Lon Nol will take power in Cambodia. Lon Nol, L-O-N-N-O-L, easy to remember, palindrome. He launches a bloodless coup in Cambodia while Sihanouk is out visiting with Mao and Zhou Enlai in China. The United States and the CIA support it because they believe Sihanouk is getting too friendly with China. Well, if you look at his policies as a country, he's actually quite anti-communist. So in 1973, through correspondences between the CCP and the Khmer Rouge, Sihanouk is snuck back into the country. And in 1973, he joins with the Khmer Rouge. Here he is in some very high-profile images of his visits. Hunim is seated just on the right-hand side of Sihanouk, once over. So you've got Kusamfan, Hunim, Pol Pot is in the distance there, and then closest to us to the left of Sihanouk, you have Hu Yun and Yang Sari. So that's all the big names of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, all the big Khmer Rouge names to this point. That will change when they take power. In 1975, with Sihanouk now supporting the Khmer Rouge to reestablish the autonomy to get rid of the American-influenced Lon Nol, who was ruling over a brutal Khmer Republic. It is in 1975 where those who are loyal to the party's radical vision and those who are not begin to kind of fracture off. So ultimately, Pol Pot, who is the strongest personality of all of them, will bring those like Yang Seri, Nuon Chea, and Sun Sen, who are deeply loyal to his vision. He'll bring them close into forming a party center, where more moderate figures like Hu Nim and Hu Yun, who were genuinely in this for improving peasant standards, start to question Pol Pot. Hu Nim and Hu Yun both vocally challenge evacuating the cities in 1975, and Hu Yun is killed because of it in 1975 or 76, we don't know for sure, but the record has it that Hu Yun was executed on Pol Pot's order because he questioned abolishing currency and evacuating the cities. So here I just have the major figures of the Khmer Rouge. Once they take power, Hun Sen will lead the Santabal, the secret police of the Khmer Rouge. So these are all the figures there. And just some official titles there. Of course, they are a Marxist-Leninist regime. Anybody who says that they're not has clearly not read anything that the Khmer Rouge has ever written or said. And I just have some, some names here: Brother Number 1, Brother Number 2, Brother Number 3. That's a common feature of the Khmer Rouge. Hu Yun and Hu Nim never lived long enough to see this. So just to quickly go through some images, courtesy of the Documentation Center of Cambodia, detail life and experiences there. Of course, it was a brutal regime. 1975 to 76 experienced a genocide run by the Khmer Rouge, who, as per the slogan that you see here, the 1 versus 30, Pol Pot actively encouraged all Khmer people to slaughter all Vietnamese, both in the country and abroad. And this becomes a hallmark feature of his grotesque, perverted version of Maoism. Another aspect of his version of Maoism is to attack monks, Buddhist monks in particular. Here I have some slogans, courtesy of Henri Lecau's book, the Pol Pot's Little Red Book, in which he refers to monks as tapeworms and parasites. This kind of dehumanizing language is a big feature of the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot. And then just some of my photos of S21, or Tuol Sleng Prison in Phnom Penh. This converted school was turned into a prison where political prisoners of all types would be imprisoned and tortured, and they'd be forced to write confessions of their crimes. Hu Nim wrote many pages of these in his own time. I'll get to that question in a bit, sorry. So here I just have from Kiernan's book, The Pol Pot Regime, an estimate of how many people were killed during the Khmer Rouge era, some of whom died because the party's ridiculous and foolhardy policies, like the super Great Leap Forward, attempting to outdo Mao's Great Leap Forward without the industrialized base behind it, no less. And then just through extrajudicial killings of Vietnamese Chams and Thais and various other like monks and things like that. So just kind of moving on here, just to conclude, again, I've covered a lot here, and I thank everyone for your patience. But the goal of the book and in this talk was to look at the Maoism that emerges in Cambodia as very much part of a dialectical process, with encounters and experiences shaping how these intellectuals received, practiced, and adapted radical thoughts from outside. What happens in China is not necessarily going to happen the same way in Cambodia. Their socioeconomic classes, there are different factors and features in all cases. The landlordism in China was much worse than in Cambodia. The soil in Cambodia is much worse than what's in China. So there was necessarily going to be adaptations to it. And that does not make it un-Maoist to do so, but in fact, the opposite. The key point here is to look at the ways in which social experiences and lived culture acted as moderating variables that form building blocks of the body politic. Hu Nim's experiences growing up in poverty made him very attuned to helping peasants and improving their lot in life. He was very much interested in that because he was himself a peasant. He could identify with their struggles. And ultimately his care for the society's disenfranchised poor was what ultimately led to his demise. CPK Maoists ultimately took different routes to their radicalization. Pol Pot never extensively read Mao's socioeconomic analysis of the countryside. He never read his Xinguo investigation or his Xinwu investigation, but Hu Nim did. And it is interesting to look at the ways in which Pol Pot's drawn to the radical kind of faith Maoism of the Cultural Revolution, right? I see the cult of personality. That's the Mao that I want. Whereas Hu Nim and Hu Yun and others are drawn to the bureaucratic kind of like the rational bureaucratic the managerial aspects of it. Here are all the classes. Here's how we can help this class. Here's how we get rid of these landlords. It's all very much managerial in that respect. Hunim is drawn, of course, to these socioeconomic analyses to diagnose Cambodia's political instability, underdevelopment, and socioeconomic inequality. He embraces a more radical anti-revisionist stance after the Cultural Revolution, when his political career is almost over and his life is in danger. So ultimately, I want to say thank you, everyone, so much for your patience and with me going through all of these materials. And I look very much forward to your questions. And thank you again, Miguel, for hosting me.
Thank you very much, Matt. Vamos a pasar a las preguntas. No sé si el público que nos escucha quiere hacer algunas preguntas. Yo tengo muchas preguntas. Matt, is possible watch again your presentation because doesn't work?
To put the presentation back up?
Yes, in 5
Absolutely.
minutes, please. Because
absolutely. Sorry, I just removed it so that I could see everybody more clearly on the Zoom
yes.
screen. So here, let me do that.
Yes, in 5 minutes only for watch. I can watch Albert Camus. And yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you. Mientras Matt presenta rápidamente sus imágenes, no sé si hay alguien que quiera preguntarle. Yo tengo varias preguntas mientras se animan. Voy a hacerle las siguientes preguntas o voy a preguntarle 2, 3 cosas a Matt.
En el chat escribí una para que la mires.
Ah, bueno. Frank escribió una pregunta, no sé si Matt la puedes ver. Y te hago 2, 3 preguntas adicionales y luego tú escoges cuál.
Brenda también preguntó otra.
¿Quién?
Brenda, y están llegando otras.
Ok.
En el chat.
A ver, no veo el chat aquí.
Lo que pasa es que, claro, ya coloca mía porque está directamente a Matt. Entonces,
ok.
toca colocarla es para todos, averigua.
Para todos, sí.
Sí, ya he cometido este error hoy. Listo.
Well, I could start by answering Brenda's question first and then move to Frank's.
Okay.
Sure. So thank you so much for the question, Brenda. I'm absolutely honored. I would love it if you read my book because I'm such an enormous fan of your work. To answer your question, it's a great question, right? Because I struggle with this as somebody who's a sinologist who works on Southeast Asia, but also is trying to break into my own fascination with Sendero Luminoso. And I think that when doing intellectual history, it is always difficult to really do a truly global history because on the one hand, you have your positionality as looking at intellectuals, people who are culture bearers, people who are producing, but they're mostly, what they're doing is not accessible to everyone. This is the big challenge that anybody has, and it is something that I find is quite fascinating, is that the Maoists are there trying to do as Mao did, go to the countryside, talk to peasants, ask what their grievances are, and then interpret their grievances within the framework of Mao Zedong thought, and then frame practice around those ideas. And it is not through getting everyone to read Mao Zedong thought from the farmers to the workers, but it is through the kind of going out there, that outreach, that almost evangelistic approach spreading those ideals, that they do it through practice. In terms of how to do a global history with, from Latin America, I mean, I like preach. I had struggled so much as an undergrad, someone with an enormous student loan that only recently I could pay off, and that there are so few opportunities to receive foreign funding for this. But this is what I think is so fascinating about, and I hope that they bring this back. Maybe it'll take when Xi Jinping goes, but there are so many opportunities, Taiwan in particular nowadays, to get fully funded language training. And there are so many countries in Latin America that still recognize Taiwan. And even those that don't, like Canada, have good relations with Taiwan. So I recommend anybody who's interested in kind of doing a global history with China or Maoism, or just anything coming from China, or cultural diplomatic exchange from Asia, to think of Taiwan as a possible site, because their archives are open, and it's relatively easy to do it. And you can even do preliminary research online to find out what they have. So I think that's one way to do it, that kind of moves away from relying on that inability to get funds. Because I'm sympathetic. It took me forever to get any funds to do my research, and I was only very lucky to get, like, last person chosen to get a government grant to do my dissertation research in Cambodia and China. So I think it is possible, but it is extremely difficult. One of the best ways to get around this is exactly what we're doing today, is through those international collaborations. I would absolutely love to do archival research in Lima. I would love to do archival research in Montevideo, but I can't do that as easily from Australia. So through that kind of creating that kind of those bridges, those connections with people, and I'm always keen to share my sources. So just kind of a way to do that scholarly exchange might be the best way to do it. And getting into touch and sharing each other's what each other's cool work is doing, and what cool research we're up to, might be the best way to kind of circumvent those restrictions. But I hope that things do change in Latin America, and that there is more opportunity for funding historians, anthropologists, political economists themselves to go and fund 1 year abroad, or even 6 months abroad, in places like China and Taiwan.
Ok. ¿Alguien más en el chat?
Shall I answer Frank's?
No, Brenda. Brenda, thanks, Matt. I hope you'll be able. Yes. Okay.
So to answer your question, Frank, gracias. Thank you for the question. I love talking about sources. So I'll try my best to keep this a little bit shorter, because I have a tendency to ramble. So on this, the big sources that I use are very much archival documents. So I was able to obtain the doctoral dissertations of Hu Yun, Qiu Samfan, and Pukche, as well as Hunim, through 2 archives. One is the Bibliothèque Cujas, or the Cujas Library, CUJS, in Paris. And because all of these students, when they wrote their dissertations, they went into the record, they stored them. And it was annoying. I had to photocopy them, and there's 500 pages, one by one, not the funnest. But that's one way to do it, is to go and access the textual record of these ideas. The other place I got these dissertations was the National Archives of Cambodia in Phnom Penh, which, if you do research there for a couple of days, it's free. I was there for a couple months, so I had to pay, but it's only $15 US, so it's not a big expense. And the photocopies are cheap, and they have originals. Unlike the Documentation Center of Cambodia, where I've done other research, where I've gotten the forced confessions and a lot of the images, they will only let you look at copies of copies, which is increasingly more difficult to read. So I'd say the biggest amount of research that I did for this project was in Paris and in Phnom Penh. I'd say Phnom Penh first, Paris second. China, Shanghai particularly, I received a lot of materials about Sihanouk's visits at the Shanghai Shidangangguan, the Shanghai City Municipal Archives. It's no longer open to foreigners, unfortunately. But that's fine. There are other municipal archives like in Kunming, which should have even better information on that. It's just a shame that China, the People's Republic of China, is so strict on even letting their own citizens into archives. And then the final place that I received a lot of materials was in Xiamen at the Dongnanya Yanzhou Zhongxin, the Southeast Asia Studies Research Institute. And this is at Xiamen University in the town of Xiamen. And because it's not an archive, anyone can go in there. And what it is it is a collection of Chinese language newspapers from Southeast Asia. And it's where I got Mianhua Bao, China Khmer Daily. And that was such an important source to find a gold mine because nobody's ever written about it. Most Cambodia specialists work only in French or will work with French and Khmer. None of them are working with Chinese too. And that newspaper is so important for understanding the political values of China at the time, the way the Chinese communities feel, what their activities are, and to see how the parallel campaigns of China are manifesting in Cambodia, right? The export of Maoism in practice emerging on the ground there. So those are where all of those are. In terms of understanding Hu Nim's own things, like I said, his forced confessions when he was in Tilsing prison are extremely, like, you got to be very careful with those because he admits to being like a Vietnamese agent and working for the CIA. It's all what the torturer wanted to hear, right? So what's important about using those materials is that you have to separate that which is obviously fiction from those important details about his early life. And it's hard to do that. So they're useful sources, but one must use them with caution. So that would be a good kind of overview of the materials I used for this book.
Matt, I have a question. When the people think in expression like,
Sorry, Miguel, should I answer Frank's question, follow-up question or?
okay. I have problem with my PC. I don't watch you.
Oh no.
Okay, but the question is about the uses of different concepts by people like Julia Lowell and your works too. When the people think in expression like global Maoism, we found in many papers expression like China sport Maoism. But another problem is the reception of Maoism. And another possibility is the expression traduction. What do you think about this different expression? Is possible to think in Maoism was exported?
Thank you, Miguel. 100% it was exported. So the CCP was actively translating Mao's materials. They were even sending the Red Guards to go and fight in the Vietnam War and do things like that. And then in places like Tanzania, building the Tazara Railway, Chinese experts, technological advisors were traveling with little copies of Little Red Book in English and Swahili to give to the workers so that when they were having a break, they were at least studying Mao's works. Now, how that actually lands on the ground varies, right? When you have a place like Cambodia where you have an intellectual thrust that was already interested in communism, they were interested in gaining independence, they had read the French classics, and communism seemed like the most useful tool to liberate Cambodia, then it makes sense that Maoism would be appealing because it's grounded in the Asian historical experience, or at least the historical experience of a country in Asia. It is more recognizable or identifiable. It's a little bit harder to reconcile, and that's why I'm so interested in Sendero Luminoso, why Maoism emerges as a major intellectual ideological discourse and ideological program, or ideological system, as I call it, for Peru. And this is actually kind of a good branch off to answer somewhat Frank's question, is that both the guys like Pol Pot or Huyun and Hunim had read a bunch of materials before. They were drawn to the heroes of the French Revolution and their own immersion in Buddhism. Abimel Guzman obviously was a major fan of Jose Carlos Mariátegui. And arguably there is more of Jose Carlos Mariátegui in much of what Abimel Guzman says than Mao. Mao is the practical dimension added because Jose Carlos doesn't say launch a revolution to liberate the Indios. He doesn't call for a broad-based violent insurrection. It is Mao that does that. So the combination of those two really distinguishes the ideology of Sendero Luminoso. And for Pol Pot, he's drawing from his own interest in the French classics. He's drawing from his own interest in Buddhism and this concept of the original Khmer, that all these outsiders have been a contagion on Cambodia and they must be removed. So it actually shares a lot with very ultra-nationalist strands of ideologies. So I think that in that way, they're kind of similar. They're both trying to use the intellectual frameworks that they have, and then they're almost grafting to a certain degree Maoism on top of it. But in so doing, they start to kind of latch on to more and more of those Maoist aspects as they realize that there's a lot to the policy angle of it that can be used as well. The problem, of course, with Abimel Guzman is he tries to copy Maoism a little too closely by creating his own cult of personality. And ultimately, with his capture, Sendero had no chance to actually win. Now he's died. So, at long last, yeah.
No sé si la imagen se congeló, se perdió, Fran.
No, tú estás,
no los veo.
No importa, te vemos perfectamente y te escuchamos perfectamente.
Pero no los veo a ustedes. No sé si alcanzó Mara a escuchar mi pregunta o no, las preguntas que hice.
About Julia Lovell, Matt.
No sé, voy a repetir la pregunta en español a ver si Matt me sigue, y si no la hago nuevamente. La pregunta, Matt, es sobre la noción de el maoísmo como un modelo que se exporta. Y hay una polémica alrededor de esta expresión. Nosotros en Latinoamérica preferimos utilizar traducción en el sentido de adaptación, uso, transformación de un concepto. O tú has empleado la noción de recepción, pero en tu libro utilizas un título que es precisamente asociado al Red Evangelism. Entonces, ¿cuál es tu percepción sobre estos diferentes conceptos cuando se piensa en la noción de maoísmo global? No sé si me entendiste o te la hago en inglés, medio inglés.
No worries. I think I gathered it, Miguel, and thank you for the question.
Y una segunda pregunta de una vez. sobre la formación de los líderes como Salazar en esos dos modelos extremos. Por un lado, la educación francesa, el modelo francés con conceptos, con propuestas conceptuales muy particulares versus el modelo chino, el modelo maoísta. ¿Cómo ves, cómo percibes esa tensión entre estos dos modelos?
Gracias, Miguel. I think I'll answer the second one first, just because I think that's the one that I can answer the most succinctly. So I think the important thing about Pol Pot or Huyen or Hunin in learning and from the French classics is that they were really drawn to figures who were challenging authority and who believed in the rights of men. And they're the wellsprings of Buddhist texts that they had immersed themselves in. All Cambodian boys have to study for a time in a pagoda. I think they were drawn to that. They see like, oh, well, a guy like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Robespierre clearly cares about, he's compassionate about the people around him. He has good kind of this good almost karmic force behind him, you know. So I think they're drawn to those figures partly because of that. The big reason is because they challenge authority. They're challenging an unjust regime. So I think that is how the immersion in the French classics makes something like a Stalinism or a Maoism palatable. Certainly a Maoism palatable, because it's another example. This is a tool with which you can destroy your oppressor. It is a system that if you implement, you can have the same successes as the Chinese Revolution. At least this is how the CCP is marketing it in the 60s. So I think that there's that attachment, that comradeship of the classroom that they forge in the 1930s. Then when they go to Paris, they're all kind of together in the late 40s. And then again, they join the Communist Party of France together, and they see its transition to a Maoist party, or at least a party that's pro-China and less pro-Stalin. And then when they go back to Cambodia, and some join the National Assembly, whereas others go to fight in the countryside, they're seeing the utility of these ideas in practice. So I think that common feeling of we need a tool to defeat our oppressors. First, it's the French, then it's the American imperialists and the capitalists who are keeping Cambodia poor in a cycle of poverty, as Samiramin would call it, cyclical phenomena of dependency. That's what makes Maoism especially palatable, and drawing on that French revolutionary inspiration. As for the first one, I mean, red evangelism is something that I conjured up way back in 2016, and I initially wanted it to be a placeholder title for my second chapter. What I mean to say is in contravention to what you see in secular evangelism, say of Taiwan, where Taiwan's seeking to build allies among countries as its international influence and alliances wane. It'll send technical advisors and economists and agronomists to foreign countries, like a country like Belize, and they'll just invest a ton of money in developing a crop there or developing a road, and it's just this way of kind of building those fraternal relations without necessarily a religious underpinning. What red evangelism is versus secular evangelism is there is this expectation that there would be the sowing of the seeds of interest in China, Red China specifically. That the PRC's relationship with Sihanouk is not purely, yes, it sells the revolution to the Chinese back home, and yes, it looks internationally very good. Look at China, it's building alliances with non-communists. Maybe we were wrong about them. Maybe we shouldn't isolate them so much. So there's that aspect to it, but there's also this aspect that if the prince, who is beloved in Cambodia, has personal friendships with Chinese leaders, and he's going to China every year or several times over the next few years, there over time, people who work for him or on scholarships funded by his government will take an interest in China because he took an interest in China. And that grows slowly over time. That China-Cambodia friendship becomes a China-Cambodia exchange. And that China-Cambodia exchange leads to a Maoist party. not directly, but as my talk and book will show, it is several stages. And all these factors kind of come together in fostering that. So that's what the red evangelism aspect is. And it's got two main parts to it. Having that, the personal witness of evangelism in the kind of Christian evangelical tradition is you have the personal witness, either of God or Jesus or what have you. And then you have the Holy Scripture, mastery of the Holy Scripture. So that would be the Little Red Book and Mao's translated works.
Fran, como no veo la pantalla, no sé si haya más preguntas o más comentarios.
No, están aquí las preguntas, las que tú hiciste, las que se hicieron en el chat. Mada aquí nos comparte el link de una revista que es Historia del Partido Comunista Chino, en donde está la reseña de enlace del texto de Galway. Es además una revista muy interesante porque aborda temas de historia china. La recomendamos, también la vamos a dejar aquí en las memorias del Congreso. Agradecerte también que nos compartas estas producciones. Pero Miguel, ya digamos, lo que vi en el chat ya lo planteé y más lo abordó. No sé, creo, me da la impresión de que Miguel Imagine is stop. Entonces, creo yo, miremos si Miguel se logra convocar nuevamente. Me da la impresión que tiene problemas de conexión. Brenda, no sé si tú quieras agregar algo más antes de cerrar la sesión de hoy.
No, muchísimas gracias, Matthew, muy interesante y aguardo la versión para su lectura. Y quedamos en contacto para toda esa información que compartiste hoy también. Muchísimas gracias. Pobre Miguel, se le desconectó.
Sí, bueno, a las personas que nos deja Mate su correo electrónico para preguntas, intercambios, invitaciones. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much, Matt. Damos por terminada la sesión de hoy. Y los invitamos mañana, 10 de la mañana, hora Argentina, 8 de la mañana, hora Colombia. Vamos a tener una jornada supremamente interesante, muy nutrida. Y los esperamos puntualmente. Y no olviden que terminamos nuestra sesión en la jornada de la mañana del día sábado. Han preguntado sobre las grabaciones. Entonces, les comentamos que como las grabaciones van a un repositorio institucional de la Universidad Distrital. Una vez que me dijeron, una vez que estén compiladas todas las grabaciones de los 3 días, nos envían un paquete y la idea es distribuir las ponencias, las grabaciones de las mesas y de la conferencia de hoy en el Facebook de la Reial, pero igualmente en otros repositorios, en otros medios de las instituciones que acompañan la realización del Congreso. No las vamos a hacer llegar directamente a los correos porque es material pesado. Bueno, intentaríamos mirar si las enviamos a los correos, pero van a estar subidas en las redes de Reial y pues miraremos también qué otras entidades. Muchísimas gracias por su presencia, que descansen y mañana iniciamos otra jornada. Matthew, thanks.
Thank you.
See you later. Okay.
Muchas gracias a todos y todas for the opportunity. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Frank. Lovely to share my work. And please email me, be in touch if you're interested in studying more about Maoism or Latin America, about Maoist movements, or even leftist politics and intellectuals. Come study with me at ANU. Gracias a todos y todas. Thank you so much.
Hey, I like Pol Pot. Extraordinary personality.
Bye. Thank you so much.